What's going on, guys? Another Hat tournament has just finished up, so you already know that it is time for another tournament review where we're going to look over what decks actually entered, and then we're also going to go over the top 8 deck lists from this event. This was Moralltach Monthly 35, and it got a pretty large number of people for one of these online Hat tournaments, having 59 people enter the tournament. And as always, this was held on the Hat format Discord and then played on Dueling Book. And yeah, it's been going on for about a month because of all the different things and stuff going on with it. I believe it was 6 rounds and then cut to top 8 single elimination. And so yeah, it was a pretty cool event. I definitely covered a lot of the gameplay in my replay reviews, and there's definitely a lot more footage from that event that I plan to put out, so be on the lookout for that. But anyways, here is the breakdown of the decks that actually entered, so let's go over that real quickly before we actually get into what decks took the top spots. So here we see 9 artifact traptrix, 8 Geargia, 5 Spellbook, 4 Mermail, 4 other, which I'm sure if I took a little bit of time I could figure out, given I did, again, go over so many of the replays, and there were a lot of interesting decks. I mean, you see how diverse this graph really is. 3 Madolche, 3 Infernity, 2 Inzektor Artifact, 2 Hieratic Ruler, 1 Gravekeeper Artifact, 1, this is like the Blaze Phoenix Geargia deck. It just says on here Geargia Chain Material Burn, which is another way of putting it. 1 Lightsworn Ruler, 1 Artifact Thunder. This is like the Watt Hunter type artifact deck. 1 Heraldic Beast, 1 Evil Swarm, 1 Ghost Strick, 1 Sylvan, 1 Battling Boxer, 1 Counter Fairy Artifact, 1 Artifact Worm, 1 Gadget, 1 Windup, 1 Zera Artifact Traptrix. This is basically just the eccentric boy hat deck, sort of. 1 Gishki Hieratic, 1 Bujin, 1 Karakuri, 1 Constellar Artifact, and 1 Artifact Traptrix Worm. Now that I'm looking at the graph, one of the other decks, there was a stun deck I remember seeing, and there was also a Zilgigas OTK deck, which isn't the Hieratic Gishki deck right here, so that was another deck that had entered. As we see, very diverse. We're not seeing any Mythic Ruler still. I think what we saw, a Hieratic Ruler did enter, but no Mythic Ruler in this one. Lots of Artifact Traptrix, and obviously a lot of Geargia, but unlike other events, this time we are seeing that the Artifact Traptrix decks took the majority in terms of which deck had the most entrants, whereas for the last couple events, it's been very Geargia heavy. So here we are seeing the meta start to break down into some of these more rogue and fun deck options, which is pretty expected. People kind of get bored of the same decks over and over, and they want to switch it up, and obviously we see a very big, nice spread of decks here. Besides that, nothing too out of the ordinary. We see the return of some of these fan favorite decks, like the Lightsworn Rulers, like Heraldic. We even see like Ghost Strix, Sylvans, Battling Boxer, some of these decks that haven't really had their time to shine as of late. So it's pretty cool to see that, it's returning to what it had been before. So let's take a look at the top 8 decks. So here we have the top 8. We have in first place Lightsworn Ruler, which is pretty wild to see. I had actually recorded a video a little while ago comparing the old Lightsworn Ruler deck back in 2014 to the modern day ones, and in that video I mentioned how, this deck doesn't top as much as it had before, and so seeing this, it kind of ruins the fact I haven't put that video out to an extent. Though, besides that, it was still a good video, so I'll probably put it out after this one, though now I'm kind of wishing I could go over this list in terms of that video. But really cool to see that that took first, again, given that it was the only Lightsworn Ruler deck that entered this event. Second place, we had Sylvan. Again, only one person entered, so really cool to see, these one-of decks taking top spots. As usual, it says like third and third, so this is going to be third and fourth place, was that Watt Hunter artifact type deck. And in the other spot, we had the Chain Material Burn Geargia deck, so the Blaze Phoenix FTK or OTK, whatever you want to call it, type deck. Very cool. Again, more diversity in this top cut here. And then we get into, what is this, 5th and 6th place, being Geargia and Artifact Traptrix. Obviously, we'll have to see if this is like pure Geargia or Geargia hands, and then if this is like Artifact Traptrix or like a variant like H.A.T or something like that. Moving into, what is this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7th and 8th place, we see Artifact Gravekeeper, another really cool deck, and Geargia in the, 7th or 8th spot. Again, we'll have to see if this is pure or what's going on with it, but a lot of these, repeating names that we see either from the replay reviews or just topping these events constantly. And, given how many players there were, it's not a coincidence. These players know what they're doing, and a lot of that gameplay and stuff really shows it. So I'm extremely excited to get into these deck lists. So let's get started with this Lightsworn ruler list. So here is the list. Going over it, we see 1 Blaster, 2 Card Trooper, 2 copies of Eclipse Wyvern. This is pretty standard nowadays. Same with the copies of Card Trooper. 1 Aaron, 1 Garoth, 1 copy of Honest, 3 JD. They chose to play the 2 Diablosis. Some people like 1. A lot of people will still go with 2 just because there is a high chance of milling them. 3 copies of Lumina, 1 copy of Lila. This is a little different. Most people will go with 2. So very cool to see that they are just on the 1. I guess I don't even know if cool is the right word. Very interesting, to say the least. 1 copy of Minerva, 2 copy of Raiden. Here we see they chose to go with Rainbow Karibo over the Necrogardnas. This is becoming, I wouldn't say becoming standard, but it's not unheard of for people to play this. It also, being a light monster gives you extra lights in graveyard for the copies of Light Ray here. And the other thing is there are a handful of decks, especially given the last event, where they were choosing to side the hand traps like DD Crows and Max C's over maining them. Not every deck, but a handful. So the only reason you really would go with Necrogardna in a lot of cases over the, say, copies of Rainbow Karibo is because of those cards like DD Crow. But since, again, a lot of people have started, putting them in the side, it's a lot more safe right now to actually have these. After that, we see 1 Redox, 1 copy of Revival Golem. This is a really cool card. The main effect of this that you need to know is the fact that when it's sent to graveyard by a card effect, it special summons itself. So when it's milled, it special summons, and it's another level 4, which is really cool. Interesting, though, to see now 2 copies of Wolf. This card's always very bricky, but I guess the way they were going about it, they would rather have the extra copy because a lot of times it is nice to have an extra body to actually go and push for game. Or, if you mill 1 early on, sometimes you still want to have another for your Love Oval Chain plays or, your Foolish Burial. So very cool to see some of the small little texts and stuff in here, or just extra copies or lack thereof. Moving on to the spells, we see 1 copy of Charge, 1 Foolish, 1 Lance. There were decks back in the day that only chose to play 1 Lance, either because of space or just, if you see it, you see it. If not, you don't want to be bricking on this when you would rather see some of your monsters or just like your power spells. 1 Mind Control, 3 Solar Recharge, 3 Soul Charge, 1 Breakthrough Skill, and 3 copies of Needlebug Nest. Overall, really nice list, very solid. Moving into the side deck, we see 1 copy of Cycle Reader, 3 DD Crow, 3 Maxi, and they are siding the 2nd copy of Lila. So again, here we see a lot of the hand traps in the side, which is pretty normal, I would say, for Lightsworn Ruler. Some people will play the Maxis in the main simply because it works with Redox. And I guess one other thing to note here is they're only on the 2 Dragon Rulers. Over some builds will play 3, others prefer 2. So very interesting to see that, but at the same time, it's nothing out of the ordinary. Dark Hole, the 2nd copy of Lance, 3 MST, and 2 copies of Decree. Again, just having diversity in your back row removal is very nice. Moving on to the extra deck, we see Black Rose, Leo, Michael, Scrap Dragon, Star Eater, and Stardust. For the Synchros, Thinking about it, I don't think there's anything else the deck usually plays in terms of synchros. I guess you kind of have the option. Some will play like something like a Stardust Spark, but overall, nothing too crazy there. For the Xyz, we see the Dweller, Exciton, the Alucard, Levier, Lavavel Chain, Dracosac, Big Eye, 101, and Engineer. Again, very standard for the extra deck too, so not a whole lot to say. Very clean list as a whole, no complaints really. It looks really cool. And again, it's crazy to see this deck finally take a top spot again. It's been a little while. So without further ado, let's move on to the next list. Here I have the Sylvan list. They are on 3 Curry Bandit, 2 copies of Lone Fire Blossom, 1 Spore, 3 Hermit Tree, 2 copies of Koma Shrumo, 1 Marshall Leaf, 2 copies of Princess Sprout, 3 Sage Koya, and that is it for the monsters. So again, nothing too out of the ordinary. This is another one of those decks that kind of choose to side their hand traps over maining them for the most part. 1 Book of Moon, 1 Foolish, 1 Lance, 3 Fertilizer, 2 Sylvania, 3 Soul Charge, 3 Sylvan Charity, 2 Terraforming, 3 Upstart, 2 Call the Haunted, and 2 Rivalry. That is something that's, kind of different. Usually you'll just see people play like anywhere from 1 to 3 traps in this deck, either being something like Vanity's Emptiness that we see here in the side, or just like copies of Rivalry. So seeing the Call the Haunted is a little different, but at the same time, that is very nice, especially this is a deck that can OTK very easily. So I guess having this as extra access to that, or in a lot of cases, because you do have the Miracle Fertilizer and you can't normal or set the turn you activate it, having Call the Haunted is just another good way to be able to bring back your guys, especially in case your opponent, say for example, uses something like a Breakthrough Skill or Fiendish on your 1 monster you got back from the Fertilizer. So this just kind of gives you extra access, and then you're able to, go and still try to make plays, whether that's an Xyz or just extra excavating abilities. So pretty nice there. Moving into the side deck, we see 1 DD Crow. Very interesting to see this as a one of, while cards like the Flying Sea here is at 3. Though I guess in terms of decks that this kind of struggles against, it does kind of get hurt by things like Abyss Dweller or things like Ophion, so being able to stop your opponent from putting those up is very key. So we do see the 3 Flying Sea here, 3 Max Sea, 3 MST, 3 Imperial Iron Wall. You don't want your opponent getting rid of a lot of your things. For example, like your Lone Fires, you don't want them banishing those. You don't want them banishing a lot of the times your big trees or anything, or even, getting your things debunked, since once they get excavated and sent to graveyard, their effects can trigger and stuff. So that's a cool way to stop that. And then obviously 2 copies of Emptiness that you can, protect any of your floodgates or anything with the Spark Dragon that this deck usually plays. Moving on to the extra deck, something I noticed here, and I was going to say with Iron Wall too, is I would assume in a lot of cases they were siding out the copy of Spore, simply because I see how little synchros they're playing. Usually this deck does play a handful more, so seeing that they're only on the Scrap Dragon, Stardust, and Stardust Spark would probably imply that they aren't planning to use the Spore as often as other decks, or they were just simply wanting the extra Xyz here. Here we're seeing 2 Alsay, 2 Felgrian, 2 Araya, 1 copy of Alucard, 1 Heliopolis, 1 Dracosac, 1 Big Eye, 1 Giant Grinder, and the 1 Engineer. So again, nothing too out of the ordinary here in terms of what you'd expect, given they went a lot smaller on the Synchro package. A lot of times, the more Xyz versions of this deck do tend to double up on the Alsay, Arayas, and the Felgrians. Also, I guess to keep in mind, they are main decking the copies of Rivalry, so just having extra copies of these being plants and stuff means that under Rivalry you have extra plays, especially if your opponent outs one of them. You still want to have multiple copies. So in general though, very, very solid list. Cool to see. Let's move on to the next list. Here we see the Watt Hunter Artifact, or whatever you want to call it, Artifact Thunder. This one, we see 1 copy of Beagletech, 3 copies of Moralltach, 1 copy of Scythe, so they are on kind of the full package of artifacts. This is the most standard if you're wanting to play all the artifacts. I always like the Scythe being able to stop the opponent's extra deck cards. Having 1 Beagletech is nice. I know some people prefer more, simply because if this gets crowed or something, it shuts off some of your late game plays, but not terrible to see. 2 copies of Kage and 2 copies of Mahunter. So they were very minimalistic in terms of this. Obviously, Mahunter can summon all your thunder monsters here, whether that be, your cobras or your giraffes. And only playing 2 means that, if you happen to see your seahorse, that you can always search, any of your thunder monsters here, but you're not locked into the fact that seahorse usually, or well, I shouldn't say usually, it's part of the effect that you can't special summon during that turn. So it's good to see this, but you don't want to overly open too many copies of these in most cases, especially, since you are playing the Kages, which allow for you to still make Xyz plays under just having 1 other monster that can be normal summon. But back to the monsters, 3 copies of Maxi in the main, 3 Thunder Seahorse, 1 Mermail. This was probably just they needed an extra monster, and it's nice to search the trap holes. 2 copies of Cobra and 2 copies of Wat Giraffe. These cards are so good. I always say how good Giraffe is. Just being able to do some damage and then main phase 2 just break your opponent's whole board is so nice. Great card. It's interesting also, now that I'm looking at, they aren't choosing to play Honest. I know a lot of builds like this do choose to play Honest, but I guess, again, you really just want to see the pieces that work with the deck and not as much the random cards that might come up in weird situations. Like standalone Honest isn't as good as like a standalone Wat Cobra or a Mermail or something like that. Moving on to the spells, we see 3 copies of Ignition, 2 copies of Double Cyclone, very standard. 2 copies of Instant Fusion. This is always a good ratio to play in a lot of decks, because it's once per turn, so you don't want to see too many of it, but you want to see it when you do want to see it. 3 copies of Duality, which works really well when you have the Seahorse, simply because you won't be able to special summon, so this is basically just for your setup. 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 3 copies of Call the Haunted, 1 copy of Warning, 1 Torrential, and 1 Traptrix Trapple Nightmare. Really nothing bad to say about it. Some of the ratios are like kind of awkward if you're looking at it from like modern Yu-Gi-Oh decks nowadays are playing 3s of everything. So that's a little weird, but at the same time, I love my 2 of, so seeing this is actually really cool to see. Let's look at the side deck now. We see an extra copy of Scythe. I know this player had topped the last event or the event before that with Constellar Artifact, I believe, or maybe it was a different deck. I think it was Constellar Artifact, and they like to side the extra artifacts. I think last time they were playing an extra Beagletech too, so not really surprised to see this extra Scythe here. And I guess in a lot of matchups, it is kind of nice to throw your opponent off and have the extra one, especially when you're playing things like Call the Haunted and stuff. So if you're Call the Haunted and one gets crowed, then you still have access to it later at another point. 2 copies of DD Crow and 1 Flying Sea. It's been kind of a trend for some decks to play like 1 Flying Sea if they need it. It's always, a card that is very good in a lot of random matchups. 1 Dark Hole, 1 Dimensional Fissure. The 3rd copy of Double Cyclone, I would assume this comes in when the extra Scythe comes in some cases. 1 copy of Mind Control, 2 copies of Blackhorn, 1 Breakthrough Skill. I just realized they weren't on any other real negation, I guess, besides the Traptrix Trapple Nightmare, but this kind of counts as 2. 2 copies of Debunk and 2 Memory of an Adversary. Very cool card. This used to get played a lot more in like the Spirit type decks, because you kind of want to keep your monsters in a lot of cases, and this just makes so you're taking the damage and then banishing the opponent's monster, and then like during the end phase of the next turn of theirs or something, you special it. So very neat little card there, and especially since so many people are on hands and stuff right now, it's kind of a great card to be able to almost out the opponent's hand without destroying it. And then for the extra deck, we see 1 Mavelus and 1 Ojamanite. These are just your 4 and 5 target for instant fusion. 1 Dweller, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 copy of Constellar, what was this one's name? I'm forgetting the name of this one right now, but it makes so your Constellars are unaffected by spell and trap cards for the turn. It's not, no, I forget the name of this one. Oh, Omega. I believe that's the name of this one, Constellar Omega. 1 copy of Pleiades and 1 M7. So again, they're only playing, actually, now that I look at it, they aren't playing many rank 5s in general, which is very, very interesting. I guess, they were more so prioritizing their 4s in this deck, which we can see. 1 copy of Exciton, 1 copy of Cowboy, 1 King of the Feral Imps, 2 101s, 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship, and 1 Tyrus. Yeah, very interesting to see them only playing, a couple 5s, not going with like the Volcasaurus or anything like that. Though I guess not playing Durendal makes sense because they are playing the extra copies of Double Cyclone. Interesting though. Very, very interesting. So kind of cool to see, very unique and off the wall, but I like to see decks like that. So anyways, let's move on to this next deck list. All right, so here is the next deck list, which is the Blaze Phoenix Geargia deck. And they are on the hands, and obviously you need the fires to actually use the Blaze Phoenix. So here we see 3 copies of Firehand, 3 Accelerator, 1 Geargiano, 3 MK2, 3 Armor, 3 Arsenal, 2 copies of Ice Hand. So they are going with the 3 and 2 ratio. Obviously the fire hands are more important in this build specifically than the ice hands, and also I already kind of can see the trap stuns. So the back row removal isn't as important because as long as, your chain material resolves with your fusion gate, you're probably going to be winning the game there. So seeing that isn't unheard of. And then they did choose to play 1 copy of Planet Pathfinder. This, modern players know what this is because of, different decks and stuff. But this is pretty much you just tribute it, and I think it's add a field spell. I don't think it's activate, but it's a way to get to your fusion gate, which is going to let you, fusion summon in a lot of different ways by, I think it's the fusion material or chain material, I believe lets you use cards from your deck for fusion summons for the turn. And then Fusion Gate, I believe, is the one that lets you use them from your graveyard, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. It's been a little while since I read them, but the idea is obviously to get to your chain material and your Fusion Gate as quickly as possible. Besides that, we see the 3 Soul Charge, 1 Bottomless, 2 Breakthrough Skill, 3 of the chain material, 2 copies of Fiendish Chain, 3 Geargia Gear, 1 copy of Warning, 1 Torrential, and the 3 Trap Stun. So honestly, if you were to squint your eyes a little bit, it does just look like a regular Geargia hand deck minus, this extra stuff, which I'm sure in a lot of cases you just play regular Geargia, and then once you actually get to, your field spell and the trap, you just kind of win the game at that point. So really cool to see. Again, this is a deck that's been around for a while, but it's not as common for people to play it because I could see in some cases you could almost sort of brick on some of this stuff, but you have such a variety of cards that you're bound to see either your hands, which can stall out or float in and break boards, or you see your Geargia stuff and then your opponent's thinking they have to play through Geargia and then they waste a lot of their, stuff on this, and then you just, pull off the FTK or OTK, whatever you want to call it. Looking at the side deck, they play 1 copy of Cycle Reader, obviously searchable with Gear Gigan X, and being able to get rid of things like the artifacts or Bujins or Lightsworn Ruler cards is really good since it, is double DD Crow for light monsters. We see 2 copies of DD Crow. Actually, now that I see this, I'm not seeing any Max Cs, so they chose just not to play Max C. Obviously, Crow is a very good card as well, but interesting to see that. 1 copy of Dark Hole, 1 D-Fissure, 1 Mind Control, 3 MST, 2 Blackhorn, 2 Debunk, 1 Macro, and 1 Soul Drain. So in terms of the side deck, it looks like a pretty fairly standard Geargia side deck, so nothing too crazy there. For the extra deck, we see 3 copies of the Blaze Phoenix, 1 copy of this one. I forget what this thing's called. It's out of Cosmo Blazer, I believe. Let me see if I can click on this. It is Ignition Beast Volcanon. It needs a Machine-type monster and a Pyro monster when this card's fusion summoned. You can target one monster your opponent controls, destroy that target, and also this card. Then, if both monsters were destroyed, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the attack of the monster in the graveyard that was targeted by this effect. So it's basically just kind of another way to push in for extra damage if need be. So kind of cool to see that. Besides that, we see the one copy of Dweller, one copy of Coach King Giant Trainer, which it can be made with your Blaze Phoenixes to draw up to 3 cards and do extra burn damage. So really cool to see that. One Emerald, one Direwolf, one copy of Exciton, 3 copies of Geargia, one Alucard, one 101, and one Soul of Silver Mountain. It works. It looks like a pretty solid extra deck here, and in general, it's a cool list. So let's move on to some regular Geargia here, which appears to be Geargia hands, but also playing the hand traps. So I'm going to quickly just glance over the differences in a regular Geargia deck rather than go through the same cards, because, there is another Geargia deck that topped, as well as, it's usually the standard ratios for your Geargia monsters. Here, though, we see, 2 DD Crow and 3 Max C in the main. We see them, rather than some decks playing like 3 and 2 or 3 and 3, they're playing 2 and 2, which is also a very normal ratio, especially if you are playing the hand traps in this deck. So I like to see that a lot. In terms of the spells, they're playing a kind of standard ratio. They're choosing to play 1 Dark Hole, 2 MST, and 2 Soul Charge. Some Geargia builds will choose to play like the 3rd MST in the main. Here I can already see that they're choosing to side it, but overall nothing crazy there. 3 Fiendish Chain, 2 Breakthrough, very standard. 3 copies of Geargia Gear, the Warning, Torrential, Bottomless, and 2 Wiretap. I like to see that, especially, again, given we know that the last few events have had a lot more of the Artifact Traptrix and the Geargia decks. This is very good to see in the main, and only playing 2 means you're not going to brick on them too often, I would assume. And looking at the side deck, we see 1 copy of Cycle Reader again, the 3rd Crow in the side. As I always say, I love to see when they play like 2 in the main and at least have the 3rd copy here. 1 D-Fissure, 1 Mind Control, the 3rd MST, so very good. 2 copies of Blackhorn, an extra copy of Breakthrough Skill, which is, pretty good. Some builds will choose to play like 3 Fiendish and 3 Breakthrough, so seeing the 3rd there is also kind of nice. You don't always see people side the 3rd for Breakthrough, so it is what it is. 3 copies of Debunk, 1 copy of Macro, 1 Needle Sealing. I know some builds will even main this, but usually they do side it. 1 Soul Drain, and the 3rd copy of Wiretap. So kind of interesting side deck. A lot of like random one-ofs, but at the same time, like things like your Macro are very standard. Same with like your Mind Control and your Cycle Reader and stuff like that. So nothing too out of the ordinary. I do like to see when they are on a lot of the 2s, and especially the hand traps with the hands in the Geargia deck. So I like that a lot. Looking at their extra deck, nothing out of the ordinary. This is like, usually I always say that Geargia and Geargia hands have probably one of the most similar extra decks from one another. Like most builds, unless it's like obviously that Blaze Phoenix deck version of Geargia, you're usually just seeing the same type of extra deck. Like we'll compare this one when we get to the other Geargia deck, but overall, I like the list a lot. Let's move on to the next one. Here we see the Artifact Traptrix, so it does look like that is a H.A.T deck over any other variant. We see them maxing out on the artifacts, similar to what I mentioned before with the Hunder list. They're playing 3 and 3 on the copies of the hands, so 3 Fire Hand, 3 Ice Hand, 2 Dionea, and 3 Mermail, very standard. And here again, we see that the decks are choosing to side the hand traps over maining them. H.A.T is one of those decks that a lot of times they do choose to side them. So I'm not like overly surprised by that. 3 copies of Ignition and 2 copies of Double Cyclone, the Dark Hole, 3 copies of Duality, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. This is again one of those cards that some people will play 1 or 2, but usually no one's playing 3, especially not in H.A.T. 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 copy of Bottomless, 1 copy of Breakthrough, 2 Call the Haunted, 1 copy of Compulse, 1 Warning, 1 Torrential, 2 Traptrix Trapple Nightmare, and 1 Wiretap. Honestly, this doesn't look super far off from my list, actually, now that I'm looking at it in terms of the main deck, so I do like this a lot. Really, really solid, straight to the point. And yeah, no, I like it. I like when decks play like 1 Wiretap. I like the 1 Breakthrough in this deck because, again, it kind of counts as 2 different negations because it has the grave negation as well as when it's on field. So nice to see that. Looking at the side deck, we do see them playing the extra copy of Beagletech, how I mentioned that some builds will. 2 copies of Crow and 3 Max C in the side, not terrible at all, especially given how many different decks that are like really special summon heavy we saw in that breakdown. 1 copy of Mind Control, 2 copies of Knock, 2 copies of Acid Trap Hole. Obviously, expecting Geargia, this is a great card against them. They are choosing to side a second Breakthrough skill, 2 Debunk, and a second Wiretap. I like that a ton. And looking at the extra deck here, I'll just kind of go over and see if I notice anything out of the ordinary. I see double 101. This isn't like unheard of. Some people will choose to play 1, some won't. So seeing that is completely normal. Obviously, double Constellar Pleiades is normal. And yeah, I guess they're not playing anything like Emerald. Some decks will play Emerald just to be able to put back artifacts in case they're like dead drawing their Ignitions or Sanctums, or even just to keep the hands, keep going through. But in general, not seeing it isn't super uncommon. They are choosing to play Ragna Zero and Rhapsody, so I like to see that. I also really like Karen Gorgon. I feel not as many people play that as much, but in general, this is another deck that has a fairly standard extra deck, given 1 or 2 card differences usually. But yeah, let's move on to the next deck. Here we see the Artifact Hand Gravekeeper Artifact Hands, which I've talked about this before. It's really cool because with the Necro Valley Errata in H.A.T format, your opponent isn't able to banish cards from the graveyard, meaning they can't like debunk your copies of the hands, which is really cool. But anyways, here we see that they're playing 1 copy of Beagletech and 3 Moralltach, so obviously no Scythe. Very just close-knit package for this deck. And to be fair, this deck does handle decks that special summon from the extra decently well. Sort of because you have the hands, also because Necro Valley stops a lot of the big combo-y decks, for example, like Infernity or the Ruler decks, because it stops them from taking cards out of the graveyard besides their own effects, which can be really good. 3 Fire, 3 Ice Hand, 3 Commandant, 3 Recruiter, 3 Spy. Very straightforward list. They're not choosing to play the Shaman lady. I forget her name. Maybe it is just Shaman. So obviously, they were just trying to keep the monster count very tight. We don't even see things like the hand traps in the main, which again makes sense. Oh, here's the Shaman one I was talking about. So they're choosing to side it. So again, just maybe in certain matchups, it's better to just have that versus in the main. And I had put out a deck profile on this, and looking at this, there is definitely changes I would make for mine personally. And one of them from testing did end up being this, sometimes it was good, sometimes it was not, but including hands is definitely the thing that I wanted to do more so, and I dropped a couple traps from my list, but this isn't about my list. Let's go back to their list, which we see 3 copies of Ignition, 1 Dark Hole, 3 Necro Valley, 3 copies of Duality, 3 Sanctum, 1 Blackhorn. Always nice to just have a 1 random one in the deck. Especially a deck like this that wants to try to keep tempo as best it can with some of the decks that can go kind of hard. 1 Bottomless, 1 Compulse, 2 copies of Dimensional Prison. This is for opposing hands usually, because hands can tear apart this deck just as much as it can tear apart other decks. 1 copy of Warning, 1 Torrential, and 1 Traptrix Trapple Nightmare. Again, the list looks great. It's really cool to see. So looking at the side deck, we see the 1 Shaman, 3 Maxi, 3 Skullmeister. This card is great against a handful of decks, and obviously this deck can't play DD Crow because you can't under your Necro Valley. So this is a way just to stop, again, the opponent's graveyard effects that are activating. So really, really good to see that. 1 copy of Mind Control, 3 MST, 2 knock, and 2 copies of Wiretap. Nothing really to say about that. Very clean. Just like this main deck, how like you can see how well it's organized and stuff. Lots of 3-ofs or just ratios that look right. This deck, again, looks very right. Looking at the extra deck, we see 2 copies of Dweller. So this kind of goes back to how I said the hands can hurt this deck, as well as just against decks like Mermail or, say, the Lightsworn Ruler deck that has a lot of effects that do activate Engrave, even getting around things like the Necro Valley. This is just a way to stop that. 1 Durendal, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 Pleiades, 1 M7, so nothing too out of the ordinary. Again, decks like this that are playing so few artifacts usually only go with the 1 Pleiades. Interesting to see the copy of M7, though this deck kind of has room for whatever at certain points. 1 copy of Exciton, 1 Gaia Dragon, double 101. Again, a lot of decks are starting to do this more. 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship of Corn, 1 Volcasaurus, 1 copy of Heartland Draco. This is the first one of this we've seen in any of these decks so far, but very good card. It is played in a lot of decks in general. Some people might swap it out during certain formats. I think in the formats where there's a lot more of the controller type decks, like the Geargia and Artifacts, so like right now, kind of, I feel this card loses a little bit of its, ability to be as useful. But at the same time, I guess I'd rather have this than a Cowboy in certain situations also. And then the 1 Tyrus. But anyways, that is it for this deck. Let's move on to the last deck, which is another Geargia list. All right, so the last list to look at here, again, is another Geargia hands list, so no pure Geargia this time around in this event. Here, though, we can definitely see some differences right away. They are on the 2 fire and 2 ice hand, so again, very similar to the last Geargia list. But this time they're choosing to play 3 copies of DD Crow over 2 DD Crow and 2 Max C. I already see here they are siding the 3 Max C, so prioritizing DD Crow over Max C, which isn't a terrible call. I've talked about this in the past that, in my opinion, DD Crow in hat format is a bit better than Max C, actually, just because this hits so many more decks than Max C can. For example, against Bujins, this really doesn't do anything, but against Bujins, this does a lot. That's obviously just a basic example, but other than that, we see the ratios of the actual Geargia monsters being the same as any of the other ones. Here, though, looking at the spells, the one difference is, again, how I mentioned previously, they do choose to main deck the 3rd copy of MST over, the other deck I believe was only on 2 of them. They are on 2 Soul Charge as well. Looking at the traps, we see 1 Bottomless. Here we see the 3 Breakthrough and 3 Fiendish, how I said before that some builds will either play like 3 and 2 or 3 and 2. This one is maxing out on all of them. They just want all the negation, and then, using the Geargias and the little bit of hand traps and stuff to really stun out the opponent and do what this deck needs to do. 3 copies of Gear, 1 Warning, 1 Torrential, and 2 copies of Wiretap. Again, very clean list. It seems like all the lists from this event actually do look very solid. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Again, there was a little bit of, variation simply because there was a lot of rogue decks, sort of, that ended up taking some top spots, and in general, we saw a lot of rogue in that breakdown. For the side deck, we see 1 Cycle Reader, 3 Maxi, again, very standard, 1 Dimensional Fissure, 1 Mind Control. We've seen this in like most decks, honestly, playing that same thing. Same with Blackhorns, 3 Debunks, 1 Macro. Here they chose to do 2 copies of Needle Sealing, which again isn't bad, and the 1 Soul Drain. Hopefully I'm remembering that this is what that's called. I always get confused with Soul Release, the spell, but in general, yep, again, it looks very similar to the other Geargia list here. Let me see if I can go back to that one. Yeah, the only difference is obviously, I believe this list isn't playing this. They're choosing to play the 2nd. They were maining this, but other than that, a lot of it, oh, and I guess the Max Cs, obviously. So overall, though, very, very similar. In terms of the extra deck, we see Giant Hand here. Let me see if the other list was on Giant Hand. It was. And then the other thing was this build was not playing Crazy Box. And this last list here that we're looking at is on Crazy Box. Also, Zen Mains. I think, what was the other one on? Oh, the other one also was playing Zenmaines. Okay, so yeah, no, very, very similar type things. For the extra deck, like I said, this is one of those decks, the Geargia hands, that just doesn't have too much variation. It might be like one card differences usually for the extra deck, but in general, again, another very good list. But anyways, guys, this was the event. And again, 59 players is really, really nice to see. The format is growing, and I appreciate all the people who leave comments and stuff on these videos and are saying how much they're enjoying it and how many people are getting back into older formats because of this type of content. I always like to see stuff like that. And anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it. Comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future. Lots more replay reviews and different matchups from this actual event will be coming out, along with other content in general. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out. Share this video with your friends. And anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.